Today's episode is sponsored by NoCD. NoCD were one of the early sponsors and supporters of the podcast. They are dedicated to creating a better everyday life for people with OCD by making care more accessible, more connected, and more effective. NoCD now deliver exposure and response prevention sessions with an OCD-trained therapist directly inside the NoCD platform, done over face-to-face video conferencing. To connect with one of their OCD therapists, schedule a 15-minute free confidential call with NoCD's intake team. To find out more, head to go.treatmyocd.com/the-OCD stories. That's go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or visit our website for the link. Hey guys, and welcome to episode 210 of the OCDstories.com podcast. Now, in this episode, I interview Natasha Daniels. Natasha is a child and teen therapist, creator of atparentingsurvival.com, also known as anxioustoddlers.com, a website and podcast dedicated to helping families and parents understand and support their children with OCD and anxiety. So in it, we go into her story, why she got into being a therapist focused specifically on children and teens, what to consider when parenting an anxious toddler, how to involve the parents in therapy and when not to, things to consider when your child has OCD, working with reassurance seeking, resources for parents, the difference between children and teens with OCD, managing a balance between family time and treatment time, gamifying treatment to make it fun for them, and advice for parental self-care. So hopefully, if you're a parent, this episode helps you greatly. And if you're someone with OCD as well, hopefully you can take something from the episode. So thanks to Natasha, and thanks to you guys for listening. And without further ado, here she is. On the podcast today, I have Natasha Daniels. Natasha is a child and teen therapist, creator of anxioustoddlers.com, a website dedicated to helping families and parents understand and support their child with OCD and anxiety. And Natasha is the author of the book, How to Parent Your Anxious Toddler. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
It's good to have you here. And I always like to get people's stories. So it could be your therapy story, where you got into working with kids and treating OCD and anxiety, and anything else you wish to share.
Okay. Well, I grew up in kind of a dysfunctional household. I think that's probably where I got like the therapy roots, because my father was severely bipolar. And so I was kind of brought around a lot of psych hospitals and a lot of family therapy. And initially I wanted to go and help severely mentally ill adults, because my dad was just so ill and was like, nothing ever worked. So a lot of suicide attempts. And but then they accidentally in graduate school kept putting me in with kids. So every time I would have like an internship or a placement, they would put me again with like, it was a group home for young kids. It was a duly adjudicated group home. It was a shelter. And I would keep going back to the office and I would complain and I'd say, I'm not even on the child track. Like, why are you putting me with these kids? I'm working with severely mentally ill adults. And they're like, well, we can't get you out now. It was just a mistake. And they did it every semester. And then eventually I was just like, oh my gosh, I love children. So that's how I decided to work with kids. And then I discovered really that I had a lot of my own major anxiety, that living in such dysfunction, I didn't realize that I had my own issues, because I was not the one on fire at my house. And so it didn't get noticed even by myself, and started to do a lot of work on myself in my 40s, which is super sad. And then of course I birthed 3 kids that were genetically doomed. And so I always get the question like, well, were you an anxiety and OCD therapist before you had kids, or is that why you went into it? Because all 3 of my kids have anxiety or OCD. My oldest, not so much with OCD, although I would probably beg to differ, but we get into it a little bit about that. But definitely the other 2. So I wear many hats in this world.
Yeah, no, thank you for explaining that. And when you were telling that story about your placements were constantly with children and you were on the adult course, it's almost like one of the lecturers or the program leader was like, we think she would be great with kids, so let's just keep pushing her in that direction and say it's a clerical error.
I wish it was that calculated. Yeah. I was like lost in this very big university. Oh, okay. I see it more as a universe pull,
Hmm.
that it was kind of, I was meant to work with kids and the universe was like, nah, we'll fix this error.
Yeah.
So that's how I view it.
Nice. Yeah, I like it. Um, cool. Well, you're ideally positioned for today's episode because, like you said, you're a therapist with children and teens that specialize in OCD and anxiety. You have various anxieties yourself, and also you're a mother to kids with OCD and anxiety. So today's episode will be largely around the parents. So I think you're, yeah, like I said, ideally placed. Um, cool. So general question now, going back to your book, which is How to Parent Your Anxious Toddler. The question is, what are the key things to consider when parenting an anxious toddler?
I think a lot of times we take a wait and see approach with toddlers, and even with my own toddler, it was kind of funny because I was in an infant and toddler mental health postgraduate training at the time. I had a job that required me to take this postgraduate program for toddlers, and my daughter was probably like 2 at the time, and I kept raising my hand, being like, "Well, isn't this normal? I mean, seriously." And eventually the professor pulled me over and said, "Natasha, I think your daughter needs to get assessed." And I was like, "Wait, what?" And so I think the naivety of like not really being able to spot anxiety or OCD in young kids is missed even by someone like myself who was being trained, because the symptoms and signs are, they're like typical toddler behavior but more extreme. And so a lot of times even my pediatrician was just saying, "Natasha, just let's just wait and see. I think it looks kind of normal, maybe the extreme of normal, but let's just wait and see." And that, to me, that's the worst advice. I think there's so much we can do proactively
Mm.
to give our kids the tools so they don't have to grow into an anxiety disorder that we miss that window. So I would say be proactive as a parent. Trust your gut, even if professionals are telling you your child's too young, you can't do anything, you have to wait and see. There are things that we can do to educate ourselves and improve our child's emotional vocabulary, their ability to connect mind and body, that you can do in toddlerhood.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's important about that window being missed of catching them before it becomes a disorder, before it becomes OCD or full blown general anxiety disorder or anything like that. So there is your book, obviously. There are other resources like the focus on that toddler age range that are helpful for parents.
Yeah, I actually don't really focus on toddlers anymore.
Hmm.
So I wrote that book back in
Yeah.
2015. Daniel Siegel's books are awesome. I love him, and I think that's a great resource. Uh, I moved away from toddlers back then because my kids got older, and I started to find really a lot more passion working with school-aged and teenage kids.
Hmm.
So I wrote Anxiety Sucks, Teen Survival Guide, and that's really been more of my focus. But I think there are resources for toddlerhood and looking at how to approach them for sure.
Cool. Thank you. Well, that was my only toddler question. So it's on to
Good. I was like,
children
oh
now.
gosh, don't ask me any more about toddlers. No, I
Yeah.
mean, that's just, I'm at anxioustoddlers.com, but I
Yeah.
kind of got stuck with that because of where I started.
Yeah, I can see the branding on the website has altered from that, but obviously the URL is harder to change.
I've tried. Well,
Yeah.
there's a redirect.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
uh, okay, so got more questions around parenting with kids with OCD and stuff. But first question I want to ask around that is, how do you involve the parents in the therapy, if you do?
I do. I think it's really important. I remember when I first got started, I have an uncle who is a clinical social worker, and he's always been like, when I wanted to be, I wanted to have a PhD, and he'd be like, "Well, Natasha, what do you want to do?" And I want to work with kids. You don't need that. You can be a social worker, because he was a social worker.
Hmm.
And then when I started really working with kids, he would say, "Are you seeing the parents?" And I'd say, "Well, I'm like seeing the kids. I'll meet with the parents once in a while." And he's like, "It's like working with one arm without the other. You have to see the parents." In my young, naive state, I was just like, "Oh, my Uncle Steve, he doesn't know what he's talking about." But now, in my old wisdom, I always involve the parents because knowing as a parent myself, when I'm in the trenches, when it's like 2 in the morning and my child is having some compulsive behavior or they can't sleep, I need to know what to do. And so thinking that a 45-minute, 55-minute session is going to do it, and not be privy to what's happening in the session seems nonsensical to me.
Mm.
So I invite the parent in as part of a team, and I just say, we're all here as a team. Like, I get anxiety and OCD, you completely get your child, and your child gets, and I'll say to the child, and you get yourself. So we all bring something to the table, and try to level the playing field, that we're all equal and we all bring our own expertise.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And would they be in there? So would they be in there at each session, or would it just be like the initial ones for psychoeducation?
It really depends. In my early days, because I'm still learning, I would do 3 sessions with the child. Well, I meet with the parents alone the first session. Then I met 3 sessions with the child, and then I'd come back, and I always met the parents every 3 sessions to keep them in the loop. And then as I really just focused on anxiety and OCD and was very much more just skill based,
Mm.
working with older kids, so starting at like 6 to maybe 21, I found that it's super helpful to have the parent in there in the sessions. And so now, unless I see that there's like a family dynamic struggle, a lot of the teen boys I see don't want their parents in there. I
Yeah.
totally get that. We're talking about harm OCD. We're talking about really uncomfortable, intrusive thoughts that are embarrassing. So I'm not rigid, but for the other kids that I work with, that they would say this in front of their parents, or they would say it in front of me, it's nice to have the parent there, because I see them like learning as we go, and they ask questions. Sometimes they actually get help because they have anxiety or OCD, and so they're learning.
Mm.
And then they learn the dialogue, because instead of working with a child and then they go home, and then the parents just sitting there completing the OCD loop until my next appointment, which is totally ridiculous.
Mm.
We're working as a team, and so it's like, okay, mom, you're going to do this week. This is your job. And then I'll say to the child, are you okay with that? So when you say, mom, do you think I'm a bad person? Your mom's going to say, well, hello, Mr. Bossy. Are you going to be cool with that? And then the mom is getting the direction, the child's getting the direction, and we're all on the same team. So I typically go for that, unless, like I said, there's some sensitive conversation, or they just really don't get along with their parents. And
Yeah.
then it doesn't, or the parent's so anxious that they overwhelm me. That's happened a few times, where I'm just feeling like, whoa, there's a lot of energy coming from you, and I'm not able to focus on your child. So there are definitely situations that warrant separate sessions.
Yeah. Okay, cool. But kind of in an ideal world, all things going well, you'd kind of want them in if possible.
I would. I mean, not when I worked with like grief and divorce and other issues, no. I wanted them to have their own space. But I think anxiety and OCD treatment is very unique. It's very skill oriented. So I try to keep them in there.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So what are some important things to remember as a parent when your kid has OCD?
Well, often I think parents take on too much. And I can totally speak on this as both a therapist and a mom. It's so hard to not personalize your child's struggles. It's a lot of us are empathetic to the point where we're like highly sensitive, and we can soak up our child's anxiety or their OCD, and there's no like separation. It's like we're one. And I would remind parents, and I remind myself too, I have to remind myself that this is their battle. And I say this kind of ad nauseum. So people who've ever heard me talk will be like, oh gosh, here she goes again. Because I'll say, this is their battle. This is their journey. Like we are passengers in their journey, and they're the ones at the driver's seat. So we can give them direction. We can say, whoa, watch out for that bump. But if they choose to jump over that bump, or they don't even press the gas, I can't make them go faster. And so I think parentally knowing your role, like knowing what your job is in this and what you can't fix, is to help your sanity.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely important. And what about when it comes to things like reassurance seeking? Is there anything like that where there's maybe, I didn't want to put it in the wording, but kind of common mistakes that can be made?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I always say parents are the sink. And when I say that to parents, they start to get it, because at first I'll say this reassurance is like the OCD loop, and just constantly providing your child with this reassurance is growing the OCD, and they don't really 100% get it all the time. But then if I just say, look, let's go to stereotypes. You know, you think OCD is about germs and washing, and the washing is a compulsion. Most people get that. And then I'll say, you're the sink. And then, especially with the dads, I'll see like a light bulb go off, and he'll be like, oh my gosh, you're right. So every time you say, sure, you can eat that, that's not going to make you sick. Or, yeah, that's not dirty, you're okay. Or, here, let me get you a spoon and I'll wipe it off the way that you want. You just washed their OCD. And so parents get that analogy. And sometimes I have work with parents, and I don't blame anyone for this because I get it, it's exhausting, where you see the therapist as the professional, and you just take your child to the therapist and then do their magic behind closed doors, and then just bring me my child back, and then we're good to go. Like it's a cold, like we're going to cure that. And I try to explain to parents that, I'm sorry, but this is going to be a team effort. Like, it has to be a team effort, because if it's not, you're going to undo all the work and progress that your child might be making separate from you. So I think knowing that the reassurance is not, you're not reassuring your son or your daughter, you're reassuring OCD. And so I think when parents start to understand OCD, and they realize they're going to have to learn about OCD, like that's not an option. Like, even for myself with my kids, I have to understand where their OCD is coming from in order for me to help them. And then we all play a role in it. With kids, reassurance seeking is like the primary compulsion. They've got a lot of other ones, but that is a big primary one that we get to choose not to complete. It's the first one I attack because it's the easiest one, in the sense that parentally we can pull back. It's really one of the only things that we can do that has a really huge impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on it there, which is around parents educating themselves on OCD. So my question was, what are some of the most fruitful ways that you've seen parents have been able to educate themselves on OCD, in terms of really kind of grapple with it and understand it?
What kind of success do I see, or how do they do that?
Yeah. Are there any kind of ways that you often hear parents say, like, I read this, or whether it was listening to something, or they watched something, or kind of what helps them kind of OCD click in their minds, I guess, that they start to really be able to identify it in their child as and when it's happening, etc.
I think talking back to OCD by John March is one of the best books that I've seen in just helping parents feel optimistic, feel like they have the tools. So definitely reading that, I think, helps, because it just gives you kind of a synopsis. I like Brain Lock. I think Brain Lock adds a lot of hope to parents who start to who catastrophize this and think, oh my gosh, my child is never going to be able to get better. And so I feel like that's kind of an inspiring book to read. And I think listening to your podcast, is helpful. A lot of parents will listen to your episodes, and you can just get a full education on OCD through that. So I think there's tons of resources out there. It's just a matter of tapping into them. And once you get into that world, there's just more and there's more, and it's growing. So it's not like there is a deficit in education out there. It's just owning it and knowing it is what it is. I think a lot of times parents spend too much time spinning with what's caused this, and getting stuck on the why of, like, is it my fault? Is it because I wash my hands? Is it because I go back and check the oven? Are they copying me? Or sometimes partners point fingers at each other. Maybe it's because she's coddling, and maybe you created this soft child who has this problem. And so sometimes in therapy, we spend a lot of time saying the why isn't important anymore. It's just like the what to do. That's the important thing now.
Yeah, because that's a real, I can imagine, a real tough one with many parents of having that internal. I use the word almost shame or guilt of, did I do this? Did I do something wrong? Was it my parenting style, X, Y, and Z? And do you ever have to kind of stop and address that with them, or give them resources to work on it, or encourage them to do their own therapy? Or is it a matter of just kind of reassuring the parent, assuming they don't have OCD, to say, no, generally not necessarily anything you did?
It's the first thing I start with typically, especially if I see it. I mean, I address it anyway. There's a lot of things I try to like tick off in my mental checkbox when I'm starting to work with families, and making sure there's no guilt, or because the guilt will actually drive the need to be the sink. So if I feel guilty and I therapeutically don't address that, now I have a resistant parent. And a lot of times underneath that is, well, I feel bad I did this to him. So I can at least, clean off the spoon for him every time he needs to eat, or I can at least answer his questions. So I do address it. If I see that it's a major stumbling block, I'll
Mm.
spend a while on it. Um, I have podcast episodes. So normally people are so, I'm sure they're like, it's kind of funny. But when they come to see me, I will normally email them in the session. I'll be like, here, watch this YouTube video, these podcast episodes, and I just send them links. And it saves them money because I'm like, there's so much you can do online and just hear me talk, so just listen to these episodes. And I have an episode on it's not your fault. So let's just dive into it. And normally that tends to squash it because I say we can spend a lot of time on this, and it's important to know that it's not your fault so we can move on.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'll try and dig that episode out and link it in the show notes. Cool. So you work with both children and teens with OCD. What are some of the key differences you notice between a child you see with OCD and a teenager?
That's a good question. A lot. So the child is, and not always, so these are going to be stereotypes. You always have your outliers, but I think kids are easy to work with. They're harder in the sense that they don't have the intellect. And so when I try to explain things to them, I have to use a lot of kid analogies and really get them to just understand that. Sometimes when I start to personify the OCD and talk about a Mr. Bossy or, your O cloud, you have to be really careful for them not to get freaked out about that. Because when they're really little, they're like, oh my gosh, and there's an O cloud in my head, that's making me do things. So you have to be really, really aware of how you're personifying it. But then they love the gamifying version of it. And I see progress really quickly because they're so little. And the neuroplasticity is just ripe, that you can just alter their brains so quickly. That is very rewarding because you start to see progress with most kids very early in treatment. Teenagers, if they've had OCD for a long time, you're like maybe the fifth or sixth provider. They're already burnt out in treatment. They've had some really bad advice that has perpetuated their OCD. They're in that stage of development that's totally normal and typical, that they don't trust you. They don't trust anybody. Who are you, old lady? So
Yeah.
It takes a little while to build up some credibility with them that they will open up. And sometimes it's harder also to work with the parents because there's been this dance that's been happening for sometimes over a decade of being the sink. And then here I am shaking things up and disrupting their happiness, their OCD happiness, by pulling back reassurance or compulsion. But it's also incredibly rewarding because the relief that you see on their face when you say there's a name for this and there's so many people who are going through this and let me give you all these resources, that in and of itself makes up for all the other struggles with teens.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for that. It was a good distinction. Okay, so the next question I had was, I can imagine, and maybe you can speak to this as a mum with kids with OCD yourself, of that balance between at home doing the CBT homework or the therapy homework versus having family time, because I can imagine it could the kind of therapy outside of therapy time could almost swallow up family time or sometimes hinder family time. How do you kind of draw boundaries if you need to? And yeah, does that kind of make sense?
It does. No, it is a hard balance because you don't want your kids to always think that all you see is OCD. And a lot of times you're driven by your own anxiety of where this can head if you don't start working on it. And I think every parent struggles with it. I struggle with it, and sometimes feel like a hypocrite because I'll tell people you need to be doing exposures every day. It's like an apple a day keeps the doctor away, an exposure day keeps OCD away. And then I'm like, well, when was the last time I did exposures with my kids? And they've been doing really well, and so I haven't, we just haven't gone back, and things get busy, and you want to just enjoy your kids, and it is an ongoing struggle. And I think it's important for parents to not beat themselves up about that there is, it's messy and that's okay. I try to, in my family, I try to gamify it. And so all of my kids know that if I say no, like they can't have something and it's a soft no, that there's a yes behind it if they want to do an exposure. And
Uh,
so I have this app that I like modified. It's like meant for chores and I use it for exposures. I mean, there's chores on there too, like trying to be a good parent, like, hey, if you want to wipe down the table, you can get a point. And then in this app, and I just searched for like a really good, like non-babyish chore app. And so I could adapt it. And there's like a little store in there. And so I like just make these points, like you can have $5 on Amazon, or you can have some Robux or whatever. And if they do exposures, they can get points. And so a lot of times they're not taking away from our family time because they'll come up to me and they'll say, hey, mom, if I go upstairs by myself, and play the drums because my son's afraid of his room right now, can I get 2 points? And I'll say, yeah, that sounds reasonable. Or my daughter will say, mom, if I watch the pee video, because she's got this, for her OCD, she's got a pee issue, and seeing pee accidents is very triggering for her. And so she'll just say, and so she has on her iPad her exposure, and she's only 8, but I really want to foster independence. Like I want them to know it's not my deal. It's not my homework even, it's theirs. And this is how I teach parents too. I'll try to get them to set it up so it's independent. So the parent is not having to say, do your homework. And then she'll just say, can I watch this pee video? Or she'll text me on her iPad, I watched the pee video, and then I will give her 2 points and it will just show up on her iPad, hit that reward center of like, oh, cha-ching, I just got 2 points. So I think there's creative ways to try to not have OCD homework or CBT homework be like so heavy.
yeah. Yeah, no, that's really good. And that's something I guess you do with your clients and the clients' parents? You try and gamify or set up reward systems for homework?
Yeah, well, one, I don't know how people work with kids with OCD without gamifying it on some level. Because the minute I gamify it, and even with the older kids, like the 16, 17-year-olds who are kind of, I'm like their fifth or sixth therapist and they're negative. The minute I say, you like Game of Thrones? Oh, you want the whole series? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about how you can get that. Oh, you like Xbox? You want an Xbox controller? Let's talk about that. And I mean, I'm kind of fortunate in that I get Amazon credit from my website, and so it's easy for me because I can spend money on Amazon and it's quasi not mine. But when I gamify it, they light up, and I try to keep, if I can, the parents out of the loop, not out of the knowledge loop, but out of the do your homework loop. And so for teenagers, they'll text me and they'll say, done it. And then I go, woohoo, 1 point. And we keep it going. And, keep strict boundaries on that. The parent knows that they're texting me and there's no conversation. It's just did it, done it, and they have different homework assignments. They text me. And I find that keeps them much more honest. It doesn't involve the parent. The parent will come into the session and go, I don't know if he's been texting you. And I'm like, he has, she's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe he's doing that. So I think that's another way to like take the burden off the family.
Yeah, I like that. It kind of keeps the teen accountable.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And in in your years of treating children or teens, what's been let's do both actually. Let's start with children. So in your years of treating children, what has been the thing that stood out most to you? So very, very vague, but
yeah, that's okay. Children are so fun to work with. Like I love children more than I love any other kind of human being. Like they say the funniest things, and like they surprise me because they are incredibly resilient, funny, and empowered if you know how to light them up and empower them. And so I guess that's a general answer for a general question, but I feel like we underestimate kids. And even my own kids, like my 8-year-old, she just amazes me at the level of anxiety that she had. Like she couldn't even go to the cafeteria last year. She couldn't go to recess. Like she was barely getting to school. And to watch her now, like she's a little bit too much at this point. I'm like, just be quiet. I had lunch with her in the cafeteria for Thanksgiving, and she's just like screaming and shouting at people to come and sit next to her. And this is my mom. And I'm like, with my social anxiety, it's like, can you just sit down? But we just sometimes I think we underestimate just how incredibly strong they can be.
Mm.
Just because they're little people doesn't mean they're not really strong in that little body.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And same question then. So in your years of treating teens, what has been the thing that stood out most for you?
Teens are pretty incredible too. I have helped a lot of future OCD therapists. It's funny because I'm amazed at how many are coming back and wanting to make a bigger impact. And so I think that we have this generation now that is very socially conscious,
Mm.
and I'm seeing that in my practice. I've been doing it for 2 decades now, and so it's interesting. They're all getting older, like the ones that I've worked with in the past, and they're coming back and they're messaging me or they're emailing me and they're saying, Natasha, guess what? I'm a therapist. And it's just amazing that they want to take it bigger. Now, some of them, they want to write an OCD book or they want to do an illustration or they want to help in some other way. And I think it's just very cool to watch that as they get older,
Yeah.
that there's this passion of giving back. I've struggled, and so I want to give back too.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. Yeah, and I agree. This generation does seem to be thinking about how they can give back and contribute. Um, yeah. Okay. Cool. So, yeah. So, parental self-care is a big one, I believe.
Yeah.
As you said, like when your kids are up at 3 a.m., 2 a.m. doing compulsions, that's tough on the parent. What are some words of wisdom that you'd give parents on how to just look after themselves?
I think sometimes we think as parents that it's selfish to look
Mm.
out for ourselves. That, our child is having so many issues. How can we possibly think about ourselves in any way? And I think we also think of self-care as like bubble baths and chocolate and Netflix, which
Yeah.
there's nothing wrong with that. But that's not what self-care is. I think self-care is about taking care of your own mental health, getting your own therapist. There's nothing wrong with that. I think self-care is knowing when you're at your limit and going in your room and resetting or asking your partner to step in and help. I wish self-care didn't have this connotation of these surface things, when really, if you don't take care of yourself when you're raising kids with anxiety or OCD, you're going to be a drained battery. And I always explain that to parents and myself, like, I don't always practice what I preach. And so this is kind of the hypocrite part of me, is I will run out of steam and then I'm depleted. And so then when my child is having like a complete meltdown because their food is disgusting or they just can't go into a busy room or something, I'm going to bark and I'm going to be angry and I'm going to be frustrated because I'm tired,
Mm.
I'm irritated, I'm not okay. And so there's no way I'm going to be an anchor for my child. So self-care is really selfless because you have to take care of yourself because you have to be an anchor. And if you're bobbing up and down with your child because you're not okay, then now we have two people bobbing up and down. And that's not very anchoring.
No. Yeah. Really good point. Great metaphor as well. Um, okay. So, words of hope for those of OCD.
I think there's a lot of hope. I mean, OCD is rampant in my family. And some people don't realize that it's rampant in our family, because but when you are proactive and you work on it, there is so much hope because OCD is just one component of who you are as a person. And and I've seen with my own kids and the kids I've worked with in my practice that they can overcome so much more than we give them credit for.
Mm.
And when you're in a moment, like some people are probably right now, they're in a really dark place. It seems hopeless. It seems like there's no way that anything can get better, that there's no magic fairy dust, that no matter what you do in therapy or in the mental health world, that your child's going to get better. And and that's not true. And there's always hope. And OCD can turn around really quickly. I've worked with people where they were just really struggling, and even I was overwhelmed when I first met them, like, oh my gosh, this is a lot. To a few months later, feeling like, look how well they're doing.
Mm.
So sometimes it's good to put the pause on and not catastrophize and not look too far down the road because that road may not be there. That may not be the road you're going on. My son last year was like very close to being G-tubed. Like he could not eat because of his OCD. And it was hard to not catastrophize and think, oh my gosh, what is life going to be like with a G tube? And then will he ever be able to eat food? And now, honestly, I'm having a hard time coming up with exposures because he can't be triggered. So you don't know. You don't know. So there's hope.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so slight change of pace is you pick up the phone and call your 20-year-old self. What would you tell her?
Oh my gosh. I would say, stop dyeing your hair purple. No, it's not cool. No. That's a hard question. I think I would probably give her a heads up that it doesn't matter what people think, that she's going to waste another 20 years worrying about what people think, and it's going to hold her back. And that's 20 years that she could save.
Yeah. Yeah, good point. And then you've got a billboard. What do you want written on that billboard for everyone to see?
See, that one I was prepared for.
Yeah.
This is going to sound kind of cheesy, but why not?
Yeah.
I would say, what would you do if you didn't have tomorrow? Or what would you do if you only had today? Because a lot of times I think we get stuck in this rut of, we have so much to do, or kids are so they're struggling, and we don't really soak up what's happening right in front of us. And I had a minor cancer scare like a couple of years ago, super minor, but not for an anxious person. So there was like 3 weeks where I thought, oh my gosh, what if I die? And it's crazy how in those 3 weeks, once I got over my social anxiety about, well, I'm not going to have any hair, that's going to be so awkward. I went through all that, which was really interesting and enlightening, but that was my biggest worry. But then I realized all the things that I'm missing each day, like the small things that we never soak up. And I was very in the moment for that time. And it's hard to get back to that now that I don't have that scare, and I don't want that scare. But that's what I would remind people.
Yeah, true. Okay, cool. Thank you. Is there anything else that I haven't asked you today that you wish you could have shared?
No, I think my main message is parents can trust their gut. They can trust that they can be experts for their own children, and that they don't have to sit around waiting. They can start doing things to help their kids right away.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look, thank you so much for today, giving of your time, but also all the work you do with on anxioustoddlers.com, helping parents. It's a great resource.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Don't forget, today's episode is sponsored by NoCD. To find out more about NoCD and their treatment plans, head over to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or visit our website for the link. And thanks to Natasha for her time, and for you guys for listening. And quick disclaimer, this podcast is not therapy, it is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. Until we speak, take care.